Welcome to Inside Voices, a well-read magazine, Between the Pages podcast. I'm Robert Gwaltney with my host Jeffrey Dale Lofton, and we're both excited to enter into conversation today with Clay Smith, who is the literary director at the Library of Congress. Welcome, Clay.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, Clay, before we get started, I'd like to share a little bit about you with our listeners. As I stated, Clay is the literary director of the Library of Congress. In that role, he curates the lineup of the National Book Festival and oversees the library's ambassadorships, which include the United States Poet Laureate and the National Ambassador for Young People's Literature. Previously, he was editor in chief of Kirkus Reviews and the literary director of the San Antonio Book Festival and the Texas Book Festival, and also worked for Sundance Film Festival. Jeffrey?
Clay, we're so excited to talk with you today. First question. So you're the literary director at Library of Congress. And that's one of the more impressive titles I've heard. It feels like a bend at the waist bow should be required for anyone who enters your room. So what does a literary festival director do, or literary director do?
It's a great question because that was my title at the Texas Book Festival back in 2005. And whenever I meet people at a party or something and they ask what I do, I say, and they all look really, really confused. So basically, it means that I'm a curator, but of books instead of art or film. So I am looking at the entire publishing year and thinking about which books and which writers are really going to connect with audiences. And that has it has something to do with looking at the bestseller list, which is pretty easy. You can look in fiction, nonfiction, children's, picture books, every different category of publishing. But it really has more to do with knowing your audience and knowing which writers they really care about the most. And that doesn't always line up with who are the bestsellers. And there's also, an art to it where you are thinking, you're thinking about not only, who are the writers that your audience wants to see, but who are the writers that your audience may not know yet, but you think should know. And so it's giving the audience the writers they already know, but also trying to introduce them into new writers and putting into that festival that sense of sort of delight and discovery. And that's really what the art of being a literary director is. So that's the festival. My also, as Robert mentioned, I work on the ambassadorships that we have here at the library. And the Librarian of Congress, sort of by statute, is the one who decides who those ambassadors and poets and writers are going to be. But once she makes those decisions, we are the ones who send them out to different parts of the country. And sometimes that's in rural places, sometimes it's in cities. And knowing those audiences in those different places around America, that's hard. America's huge. Different people in different parts of the country. And so that's what I work on a lot as well.
So you
Robert,
mentioned, finding authors who will interest your audience beyond the bestseller list. How do you find those authors who may not be as well known?
Well, what happens is that we have meetings with publishers, like, large houses, small houses, niche houses, niche imprints within large houses. We try to meet with everybody. And we just let publicists talk to us about the books that they're most excited about. And what happens and we also study the publisher's catalogs. The publisher's catalog is the thing they kind of produce each publishing season, and it lets you know which books they're going to publish. And of course, the publisher writes the description of that book in the most like positive light. And you use your experience of publishing to try to determine whether whether that book is going to mean anything to readers and to how many readers. So, but we listen to book publicists talk to us about the books, and what happens across all those different meetings is that you start to see trends happen across the different houses. So, this might be a year for, let's say, in nonfiction, a lot of books about immigration, maybe because immigration is in the news, or it may be a big year in nonfiction for books about how the federal government looks at people's bodies. There's all kinds of, like, I'll just give you an example. In fiction this year, we're seeing a lot of novels that are kind of these multi-generational family stories. You can sort of see why. I mean, there's drama in between the generations of a family. People love that. The Covenant of Water by Abraham Verghese, did so well in the past 2 years. I mean, publishing as an art where editors will pick out writers who they think are very talented and try to nurture them. But it's also a business. So if the Covenant of Water is selling so well, publishers are going to copy that. So, the art of creating a really good book festival is like partly commerce and a lot of art. If that makes any sense.
What does a typical day look like for you, Clay? Or is there a typical day in your position at the Library of Congress?
I mean, a typical day has a lot to do with details. My office, in addition to what you had said to introduce me, Robert, we do a bunch of year-round events at the library. So, hosting writers in our Thomas Jefferson building usually on Thursday nights, which is a great series we have called Live at the Library. So it's a lot like, all those production details will pop up and I'll have to deal with those and put out little fires. And then maybe I'll have like 30 minutes or an hour to think about, oh, if I put this writer with this other writer on stage and I ask this particular moderator, that would be a great experience for the audience, And I think about that some more. And sometimes I'll look at our writers' YouTube clips and use that to think about the chemistry that a particular writer is going to have on stage with another writer that I'm thinking that they would be on stage with. So, but I do want to dispel like any young person who wants to be a literary director. I do not get to sit around and read books all day or talk about books. So, and then I guess lastly, since we have 3 ambassadors, if there's anything that pertains to them, then I get involved in that. Every time that an ambassador joins the library, we produce a book by them, so I get involved in that. And sending people out around the country is not always easy. So
Yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit about your career journey, your career path, and how you found yourself to be there at the Library of Congress.
well, I specifically found myself at the library because a friend of a friend told me about that the job was open. There has only been one literary director at the library before me. And she did a great job and established the National Book Festival with the rest of the staff of the library and, did it for a very long time. And she's a writer and actually just had a book out in February. So Maria Rana is her name and Latino Land is her book. And, she's been very generous in talking to me and helping me. But basically, a friend of a friend told me about the application, and this is my first federal government job, and the text used to describe the job felt really kind of vague to me, and so I wasn't like 100% sure that this job pertained to the National Book Festival, but it kind of sounded like me. And now I know why government job postings are written kind of vaguely, but so I just applied and didn't hear anything for a few months, and then all of a sudden I got a phone call, and then there were a lot of interviews for this job. But basically, my career has been kind of in a spectrum in the book world. So I really started out in book journalism and in book criticism. And I asked the Austin Chronicle for a proofreading internship back in the 90s. And I think they thought, this guy is so nerdy. Like, we've never had someone ask for a proofreading internship. And they gave it to me. I was a classics major. And so I guess like I spent so much time on a specific line of Latin or Greek, and punctuation mattered very much to me. So they gave it to me, and I eventually became the books editor, and I worked for Sundance Film Festival and went to this really great graduate journalism concentration at NYU called Cultural Reporting and Criticism. And they just sort of send you out into the streets to learn, how to talk to artists and writers and activists and filmmakers. And that was a great experience for me. And then I moved back to Texas and became the literary director of the Texas Book Festival in 2005. And in that, the Texas Book Festival is now one of the biggest book festivals in the country. It wasn't really that at the time that I became the literary director. So I helped grow it, and I'm, very proud of that. And but I really missed sort of like the pure work of journalism and interviewing writers and talking to writers. And I did the podcast for Kirkus Reviews and became the editor-in-chief. And then I helped found the San Antonio Book Festival. And it was from there that the library hired me. I think after 2 literary director jobs, they probably thought no one has this many literary director jobs as this guy, so let's hire him. And so here I am, moved to DC for the job.
What did you do in Texas to grow that program, and what are you taking from that experience to make any changes or enhance the programs at the library?
That's a great question. I mean, I really grew the number of writers substantially, with help. With help, you can't have a big book festival without the staff at a festival who raises the money to put on the festival. I mean, you just can't have all those books and have all the different sessions and the parties for the writers unless you have the money. And Texas Book Festival and San Antonio Book Festival, like most book festivals in the country, are nonprofits. And so money is tight. I mean, one interesting thing is that having grown a festival to make it so much larger, I'm now working at probably the most prestigious book festival in the United States, but it's not nearly as many writers as the book festivals that I used to work at. And I have to flex different muscles as a literary director when there's fewer writers. And what that means is that, unfortunately, you have to say no to more publishers who are trying to get their writers in. And when there are fewer writers, every writer has to stand for something. Every writer has to appeal to a particular kind of reader. And that means a lot more thought. When you have a bigger lineup, it's more like a big party. But when you have a smaller lineup, you have to be very targeted. It's like when you're starting out in journalism, the best assignments are probably around 150 or 200 words because they're so difficult. And the reason that an assignment like that is so difficult is because you have to know from your very first words exactly what your point is. When you get a longer assignment, 600 words, you can kind of meander, that's easier to do. It's exactly the same in creating a book festival.
I hadn't thought about that, about fewer featured artists means that there are challenges. You would think just the opposite, that the more authors you have, the bigger job it is. But it's just the opposite, it sounds like.
Yeah, it's just the opposite. I mean, there's less logistical work, I guess, but because you have fewer writers to handle, but there's so much prep work that has to go into which writers you're inviting that that you've really got to show off your artistry and what you can do as a curator. So, but
So
I love it.
Clay, how many authors does the National Book Festival typically invite? Is there a set number, a range that you stay within?
Yeah, this year we're going to have around 80 to 90. It was 80 last year, and in my first year at the library in 2022, it was 120. Um, so we've gone down a little bit. So
So it's a significant honor, certainly for those authors who make that final list.
we hope they think that way. Yeah, that's what we think, certainly.
Um, you talked a bit about why, yeah, well, changing the festival to have fewer authors, but what does go into the planning of an event of this scale? Even with 80 authors, 90 authors, it's still a huge undertaking. And as you said, it's the most prestigious, arguably the most prestigious literary festival, book festival in the United States. So what besides, sleepless nights and one of the most envied virtual Rolodexes in the literary world, what goes into the planning?
Well, the way that I often think about my job is that I get like 6 months of the year to be creative and do what I was talking about, where I research the writers and I think about what are the big trends that people want to see represented in the festival, and also in nonfiction, what are people worried about? What are the hard-hitting nonfiction sessions about, like as I said, immigration, or what are people nervous about and what are people delighted by? The rest of the year is really just production work. There are a lot of people who probably have ideas about which writers they love and which writers they'd love to see in conversation with other writers. It the the ability to do the job really comes through in being able to make all that happen. So part of the year, I just have big ideas. The other part of the year, I just have to make those happen. And that involves some persuasion. It involves a lot of diplomacy, and it involves some very detailed emails about, oh, writer X is going to arrive in Washington at 9 a.m. on the day of the festival, but their panel is at 10:30. What are we going to do to get them very, very quickly to the Washington Convention Center? So it's part dreaming and part producing, I guess.
Yeah, not all authors are great speakers, and some have a greater presence than others. Do you take any of those things into consideration when you're making your selections?
We do. I think it's disingenuous to pretend that even though it's a kind of high-minded literary festival, that at the end of the day, it's not a show, because it is a show. Now, but if a writer is new or doesn't have a ton of speaking experience, me and the staff members at the library in my department may have fallen in love with that book and still want the writer to come. So it a writer's performance ability isn't the only thing we consider. And so what you might do in a case with a new writer or a writer whose clips, don't seem all that great, is that you could think about, who's a really great moderator, who's going to be patient and kind and bring some energy into that room. There's a number of things you can do to help a writer. And that's what we do. I mean, it's important to remember, I think, that in writing, it's often like, it's like some other artistic media. I mean, a writer spends most of their time alone, and the books don't come, well, not, I mean, for some writers, they come every single year, but for most, they don't. And, getting to speak in front of 1,000 people is something that a good book festival can offer. And that can give a writer, a spark of energy and enthusiasm for a long time. And so, I feel like we're helping writers in that way.
Speaking of helping writers, what about helping others who may be interested in starting a book festival in their community? I mean, what advice would you offer? What is the most single important part of it, piece of advice you would offer for anyone who wants to, you know, to engage their community in that way? What advice would you give them over maybe an afternoon cup of tea and a bone china tea?
You're so fancy, Jeffrey Dell Lofton.
I didn't
Well,
stick my finger up.
I mean, first of all, there has been, from what I can tell, a proliferation of book festivals around the country and in some really interesting spots, that you wouldn't expect. So that's great. In general, I think the more book festivals, the better. But I would say that, as I said before, that most book festivals are nonprofits, and unless they just have a really generous benefactor, they don't tend to start out with a ton of money. And so what you need to do is you need to make sure that the entire city is invested in that. And that means the government, does the mayor know about it? How can the public schools get involved? How can you get senior citizens involved who may not have transportation? How are you going to use the public, transportation system to get people to the festival? You can't just start a book festival with a group of people who love books and love writers and then assume that everyone's going to come. You really need to get the whole city involved.
What about a what about a purpose? There are so many writers with voices that represent, I guess, the diversity of all the people who live in the world. How would a book festival organizer navigate that very sometimes um, uh, that treacherous terrain of messaging, sending a
Yeah,
particular out into the community?
sure. I mean, you know, um, it's great to be a literary director. I have worked at this and I'm proud of my career, but I'm not the only one who makes decisions about which writers are invited. And so I think some humility when it comes to being a curator or being a literary director is really great. In other words, you may love, as a literary director, you may love books set in the American West. But if you programmed a festival that way, only people like you would come. And fortunately, diversity in publishing has gotten better. It is much better in the children's book world than the adult world. And I don't think that either categories are really where they, optimally should be. But have a selection committee at your festival that is full of a bunch of different diverse readers, people who care about different kinds of books. Because you should not be the only one deciding who is featured at a festival. Diversity in publishing is not just about which diverse writers are published. It's about reaching diverse readers. And if you make sure that your festival from the beginning is full of a selection committee of people who read differently than one another, then that's a great first step.
Please share with us what early on ignited your love for reading.
Um, people assume that I would have started reading as a, toddler or something. Not the case. Um, I didn't really start loving reading until I was assigned 100 Years of Solitude in high school.
Mm.
I don't think every high school student was assigned that, but I was for whatever weird reason. And all the sort of the magical realism and the fabulism in that book, it it just it sort of lit my head on fire about, oh, like this grandmother becomes the size of a raisin, and yet that's real. Like we're supposed to believe that. It's not an allegory, it is not metaphor. That was so fascinating to me. And then after that, it just, the spark took off and I started reading all the time. So
So,
Uh,
what have you most recently personally enjoyed reading outside of the work that you do with the Library of Congress?
Yeah. Well, I do read so much for work. And I love that I moved to DC. I love living in DC, but I do kind of miss the part of the world that I'm from. And there's a really wonderful writer named Tim Gautreaux who sets his novels and his short stories in Louisiana and other places, but largely Louisiana. And someone I know recommended him to me, and I read his big Signals, his big collected short story collection, and then now I'm reading The Clearing, which is a novel set in the 1920s in a very backwoods lumber camp in rural Louisiana near the Gulf. And he has admirers, he has plenty of readers, but I didn't know him, and that sense of discovery that I love in reading him is exactly what I'm trying to give to people who go to the National Book Festival. So I'm reading him right now.
Have you had a chance to talk to him, or do you like to talk to authors if given the opportunity of works you've read?
I do very much. I mean, that used to be part of my job at Kirkus Reviews was running the podcast, and I love it because I'm given a privilege that very few people get, which is that like, oh, I love this book. I just get to talk to the writer for an hour. Like, that's my job. And what I love about him in particular is sort of this thing that gets sometimes poo-pooed or like downplayed in literary circles, but is regionalism. He knows the language and the habits and sort of the souls of the people that he writes about so well. I don't I I don't like it when regionalism gets sort of condescended to. So I highly recommend him to anybody who wants to know about that part of the world.
Thank you. So is there anything you can tell us about the 2024 Book Festival, which I think is in August every year?
It's on
We can,
August 24th. Yeah, Washington Convention Center, open and free to the public. Most of the writers are confirmed. I cannot tell you a single one, but there will be some famous writers and some non-famous. So
well, it will sure be a great show.
thank
Clay,
you.
we are at the end of our time together. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having the opportunity to meet you and speak with you about the important work that you do.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and keep it up with the podcast.
Thank you. So,
Thanks for joining.
gentle listeners, until next time, for Inside Voices, I'm Robert Gwaltney.
And I'm Jeffrey Dale Lofton. And remember, to be creative is to be courageous. Thanks for joining us.